Welcome back, guys, to episode 47 of the JPS podcast. And in this episode, I'm honored to have Borge Fagerli and Mike Israetel join me to discuss the role of training volume for muscle growth, the context in which volume requirements may differ, whether or not training volume is the primary driver of muscle growth, as well as their approach to measuring training volume and the concept of effective reps. We also discuss evolutionary dieting and the influence of seasonal changes on nutritional strategies. This episode is really good, guys, and I hope you all enjoy the discussion. Without further ado, I present Borge Fagerli and Mike Israetel. Thank you for joining me, Mike and Borge. Guys, we're in for a treat today. I have two brilliant minds in the fitness industry, both of whom I really respect and enjoy their work and contributions to fitness. And on today's episode, we're going to be discussing their somewhat divergent viewpoints on training for hypertrophy, specifically volume requirements, as well as talking about some nutrition and theories around carbohydrate intake for fat loss and muscle growth. So welcome, Borge and Mike.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
So guys, I first wanted to kick off with a little bit of a discussion about training volume and its role for hypertrophy. And volume in the literature has been shown to play quite a significant role in hypertrophy adaptations. The findings have indicated a graded dose-response relationship, so more volume produces greater gains in hypertrophy up until a point where it starts to flatline and we see diminishing returns. So, Borge, you've stated that the current trend in the fitness industry is to cherry-pick studies that show the superiority of volume, and the soon-to-be-published Schoenfeld paper, which everybody's raving about. I know Mike and I have had a discussion about this in Melbourne when he was here for the UEBC. You feel that invalidates the 6 decades or so of research that has shown that only a few sets are needed to make gains, and where multiple sets are only slightly better than 1 to 2. So is there anything that you want to say to that and why you feel that this is the case?
Well, no, I guess that's pretty much it. I just kind of tend to think that, I just found it kind of strange that even James Krieger and his previous meta-review, where he sort of just updated that meta-review and almost completely changed his stance from, well, there's this moderate volume range, which is pretty much is going to give you the maximum rate of gains, and there's going to be a dose response curve that tends to flatten out at a certain volume range, and there's also going to be a point of diminishing returns. So I just kind of find it strange. Well, now there's a new, what they say about new studies, that you have guys saying, well, how old is that study, whenever someone asks for a reference, and suddenly, well, just because it's an old study, it's invalid. We should just ignore it or something. And I kind of find that a little strange. That being said, I'm also highly interested in seeing the results. And that also being said, I'm not saying that this is wrong. I'm not at all claiming that this is wrong at all. If you look at the Bayesian bodybuilding site, Manu Hanselmans and his research group, a plot of all the studies on training volume, and if you look at that, and where they plot just effect size on the x-axis, and they plot number of sets on the y-axis, and the plot is just basically all over the place. Mm-hmm. In trained individuals, not untrained. So we're looking at people who have previously trained, and there's no correlation line at all. There's no linear relationship at all. Now, there's 2 studies that are really high up on the effect size scale. As far as I know, one of those is an occlusion study using very low loads and extremely high frequency, and I think 3 sets, 2 to 3 times per day, 6 days per week, something like that. So it's crazy high volume. Now, that study, as far as I recall, they saw that hypertrophy tended to stagnate after only 3 to 4 weeks, which is usually what you see in these occlusion studies, probably because they're using such a low load, and maybe also because they're not taking into account the swelling and inflammation that occurs when you drive volume really high. But you could sort of see the cluster of the highest effect sizes between 6 to 10 sets, but also between 10 to 20 sets. So again, if you start to dig deeper into the subject pool and the methods and the measuring methods and all that stuff, I mean, the picture isn't all that clear, in my opinion. And what I've been saying, keep in mind that I'm doing most of my publishing now in the sustainable self-development. And that kind of that's in the name. These are guys that have tried it all. These are also guys and girls that have normal lives, social lives, friends, family, children, and find that their modern lifestyle tends to conflict. Optimal meets life, as I tend to say. So I'm not at all saying that more volume will not drive more hypertrophy. I'm just saying that at a certain point, even if you gotta just ask yourself, even if you can do more, should you do more? Yep. That's number one. And number two, if you have all the recovery abilities to sustain that volume and you can gain from it, now that's perfectly fine. And if you can do that for months and years and that's worth it to you, just go ahead. I'm happy for you. But at a certain point, unless you want to be like this hardcore bodybuilder or there's always going to be a genetic and biological limit and hormonal limit to how big you can actually get. So I mean, what's the hurry? If it takes you 2 to 3 years to get there, or if it takes you 5 to 6 years, hopefully we're all here to lift for several decades. So I'm not really sure whether doing twice or triple the volume will eventually make you big as fuck, if you weren't meant to be. And so the first thing is just, the whole context is that I want to help people that have tried these higher volume routines. And I've also been working I've lost count of the number of clients that have tried the high volume routines and being obsessed about it and just tried to do everything right, but still can't make it work simply because they don't have the recovery abilities. And so that's sort of the context where I'm speaking from, and also as a guy that's 44 and probably as big as I'm ever going to get. And I don't really see spending more time in the gym being worth it for me, but it might be worth it for others. And to finish off with that rant, I'm just going to say that looking at volume in isolation from all the other variables like intensity, frequency, and again, lifestyle and recovery abilities, that's not a very good discussion to have. And I mean, we had this one guy creating a ruckus in the Sustainable Self-Development group because he claimed we advise too high volume. He said that we should all be doing the Martin Birkin or Hardgainer Stuart Roberts routines because the low volume routines are built such strong and big motherfuckers over several decades. And now we have guys going, referencing Mike and Brad and all the evidence-based crowd and their, high volume routines. And there's no other way to get big than just to do high volume. So, well, then there's me, and I'm sort of in the middle. I'm just sort of trying to fit this into a larger perspective, and also, bring in all the other variables that tend to have a meaningful difference in the grand scheme of things.
Yeah, awesome. I think you can't look at one variable in isolation, especially when it comes to training. And I think, as you said, context is extremely important when it comes to volume recommendations. Mike, anything you want to add to that?
Nothing that wouldn't be particularly supportive of that. I think there's a lot to expand upon there. I could do that later if you have. Yeah, I mean, I definitely would like to set the record straight. I mean, for the 50th time. Not that a lot of Facebook will hear about what the volume landmarks that we have say about this. And potentially, that's one of your later questions or something. So I don't want to sort of speak out of turn.
Yeah, awesome. So, I guess, Borge, you've explained before that volume isn't the primary driver of hypertrophy, and you've mentioned this in the Sustainable Self Development Group, and a lot of folk in the evidence-based crowd would probably suggest that it is, and have differing opinions to that. I guess, did you want to explain, why you think this is the case? And I guess this ties into, we can't look at volume in isolation without the other variables at play. So did you want to discuss that? And then I guess, Mike, we can kick off the discussion from there.
No, I'm just saying, well, it's a driver, but it's not the primary driver. I just tend to disagree with that. And I think a good analogy for adaptation is, we probably most of us have heard of the concept of hormesis. So you apply a stressor of a sufficient duration and intensity, and the body adapts to that. If you overdo the stressor, either by intensity or duration, then the body tends to maladapt. If you don't have the recovery resources to adapt to that stressor, and I usually tend to go back to the whole suntan analogy, and where volume would obviously be the time you spend in the sun, and the intensity would be how, the latitude you're in, or, how close to the equator you are, or what time of the year it is. So let's say for me here in Norway, if I went outside and spent time in the sun for 1 hour in January, and I just kept spending that 1 hour out in the sun until it was in the middle of June, and the sun was at its high point, I'm pretty sure I will get a suntan. And that suntan would look pretty nice, and in my opinion, it does. So, and I haven't spent more than 1 hour in the sun. So I just think that as long as you keep, there's different ways of adding volume. You can add more reps and time under tension, but you can also add more load. So I tend to think that load is a very important driver for muscle growth. And the recent Q&A I did for the Sustainable Self-Development podcast, we discussed like the avian models where they hang weights from the wings of birds. Yeah, and they noticed like some pretty extreme muscle growth in only a few days of time, where the animal or the bird would, sort of contract against a stretch of the weights. But later experiments show that by far the most impressive muscle growth probably ever seen in an animal model was when they added progressive resistance to that. So they not only had the duration, but they also had the increment in load. So I guess that's sort of just my main point, that I think you can find like a Goldilocks zone, like a sweet spot of volume where you operate within, and then you sort of just apply the right amount of load progression and also frequency, so that you sort of, again, the whole Goldilocks zone in all those variables, so that you drive muscle growth higher and higher and higher. But at a certain point, you're probably not going to get any bigger, at least not at any significant rate. So at that point, you can for sure add more volume and get maybe a higher rate of growth at that level. But again, I'm not really sure it's worth it unless, training is your life, and you just want to get as big as you can possibly can. So yeah, I think that's basically a summary of my viewpoints. But like Mike said, we can certainly go into all of those directions and discuss the finer points. But I think that's just my general point of view.
Awesome. And I think, just to clarify, so that we are speaking the same language, when you refer to adding volume, you're talking about number of sets per week, per muscle group. Cool.
Yeah.
Because that's a discussion I want to have with you both later in the episode is how we're tracking volume these days, given a few changes in the literature. So, Mike, your thoughts and opinions on that?
Oh, yeah, I think it's right on. I think that the first thing that ever has to happen before you start putting together a training program, like my colleague James Hoffman would point out, is a needs analysis. So you actually have to figure out what you need, and before that, you actually have to do a wants analysis, which a lot of people don't do. It's very easy for an athlete to do a needs analysis because their wants is to be as good as possible at the game, and then the needs are, okay, how do I get there? Some people don't even do a wants analysis where they don't even know what the hell they're doing in the gym, why, and then they're like, oh, look at this study, 45 sets a week, great, and you're like, okay, that sounds fine, but are you really willing to put in that much work? And they may not be. And I think people have a lot of notions going on in their head, but not a lot of sort of really calm thinking about a long-term process-oriented approach to muscle growth that balances trade-offs of what they want. I think that, you can split people into two camps, although it's really a spectrum between I want to get some muscle growth and look better and be leaner and stronger. And I also love, a ton of balance in my life with all kinds of hobbies and family and work and so on and so forth. And then you go further down the spectrum and you eventually reach the end, which is I want to make a run for IFBB pro bodybuilder, and I'm going to do whatever it takes to get as big as possible. And where you sort of categorize yourself on that spectrum is really going to determine where you end up training as far as volume is concerned, and also as far as frequency is concerned, and intensity, and so on and so forth. So it ends up being one of these things where you have to decide what it is you want. And I think a lot of the folks that have sort of construed Borge and myself to be in opposition on these points are really just we're speaking to two different populations. Borge is speaking primarily to the first.
Thank you.
I'm speaking primarily to the second, but not always to the second. It's so I actually have like my way of if folks come to me and say, hey, I don't know what my training volume should be for growth. If they're my clients, we have the needs analysis discussion right away. What do you want? Right. But if I assume that they want some level of muscle growth and plenty of it, what I actually in almost every case do is have them find their minimum effective volume first. So the lowest volume from which you can grow. And it's actually not super difficult to find. It just takes a couple of months. And once you find your minimum effective volume, you can see, okay, this is like the least I have to do to get any real noticeable growth. Is this something that fits my schedule and my lifestyle super well? And am I comfortable with this rate of growth? Or do I want to grow faster at the trade-off of more volume? And as soon as you say I want to grow faster, you start very slowly increasing the average volume of your programs. And then you see what kind of growth you get. Some of your body parts may reach their maximum recoverable volume quite soon into that process. Some will reach their maximum recoverable volume at 4 times higher volume than that process. So you could start out with 10 sets is the least your biceps need to grow. And some people's MRVs end up being 40 sets a week. Now, look, if you want really big biceps and you want them bad, you'll have to cycle your training all the way up to 40 sets per week every now and again. But if you want just bigger arms and 12 to 15 sets a week can get you there, why on earth would you go higher? So then it all depends on what you want as an individual. I think the big mistake people make is they try to find their maximum recoverable volume first. God knows why, because you don't ever need that until you're really at the cusp of like, I want to grow as much as possible. Then maximum recoverable volume, you'll find it eventually by just pushing. But it's one of those things where a lot of folks don't have their priorities straight, and it's just by no means clear what it is they're training for. Once they answer that question, I think it's good to find the minimum effective volume or sort of that area, and then see if you want any more than that. And a lot of that comes down to lifestyle trade-offs, so on and so forth. There's more to say on lifestyle trade-offs. I don't know if now is the best time or later, but your maximum recoverable volume will change greatly based on how much you're working, how much involved your family life is, what your diet is like, all the sports you're doing. So I think some people look at these studies and say, oh, I can train for 40 sets a week Well, no, you can't train for 40 sets a week because your MRV is not that high. And if you train beyond your maximum recovered volume, then it's really pointless and injurious and backwards. So I think another thing is making sure you know your own volume landmarks. What's the least it's going to take for you to grow? What's the most you can recover from? Know your own volume landmark, because other people's volume landmarks are completely a waste of time to you, which is why people ask, hey, is German volume training good? My usual answer is, if you want a lot of muscle growth and you can recover from it, yes. If you can't recover from it, no, it's terrible. So a lot of people don't even bother figuring that part out.
Awesome. And yeah, I think that's really important to discuss, is just how individual volume requirements can be for all the reasons you guys outlined. And I guess to speak to the second part of my questions to Borge, do you see volume as the primary driver of hypertrophy?
No, I believe I answered that.
No, Mike.
My previous. Oh, okay. Yeah.
So when you said Borge, you really meant me.
Good
job hosting this one.
Yeah.
No, I was saying what I asked Borge before about volume being the primary driver of hypertrophy. Sorry, I'm Australian. English is my second language.
Yeah. I think that intensity is the primary driver of hypertrophy in a mechanistic sense, because you can't do a lot of volume of incredibly low intensity and grow any muscle. So, but as soon as you reach a minimum threshold intensity, roughly 30% of 1 rep max, I think modulating the volume gets you a bigger yield in terms of how much hypertrophy you're doing. So while in a strict mechanistic sense, intensity is the determinant of hypertrophy, volume is a way to dose out that intensity. The dose is incredibly important. I'll put this in perspective. If you want to grow more and you're currently training at 60% of your 1 rep max on average, and somebody gives you two options. You can stay at roughly 60%, but start increasing volume so long as you can recover and grow. Or you can slowly over time start to increase your intensities and go closer to 80% of your 1 rep max, but you have to keep your volume the same. The first option will probably give you more muscle growth, whereas the second option will probably for sure give you better strength increase. So modulating intensity within a certain confine alters strength and endurance. Modulating volume seems to alter hypertrophy more so. So that would be my answer to that.
Awesome. Borge, anything you want to add to that? Because I know you've spoken about the importance of load progression and its role in hypertrophy.
Yeah, I actually tend to think that you can keep volume the same as long as it's the proper dose. And it goes back to my analogy. I was spending time in 1 hour in the sun and gradually increasing that intensity of the stressor, and that will for sure drive hypertrophy. But yeah, also strength. I don't disagree with that. But adding volume is, if you look at it from a pure adaptational, specific adaptation to impose demands, the more you increase the duration of loading or stress, that will also make the body adapt specifically to that, and not necessarily just by increasing the growth of the muscle, but also adaptations directed towards endurance and work capacity. So I'm not really sure I entirely disagree, but I don't entirely agree either. I think you can for sure get, to repeat my previous argument, how big you're going to get is going to be determined by your individual genes and biology and hormonal environment. I don't think that, to get within 95% of that, I don't think volume is going to be the determining factor. I think there are too many other factors involved, and a certain volume can for sure, and has been time tested and proven, that you can for sure get to a pretty good amount of size of hypertrophy with a quite moderate volume. Now again, moderate seems to be needed to define properly, because I tend to think it's between, let's say, 6 to 10 or maybe 6 to 12 sets per week. And I think you will also find that a lot of successful programs that many big and strong guys have been using for several decades. If you go back and read the Titan Slacks of Desoban blog and you know, the whole old-timer lifting routines and all that stuff, and you can see that there are many that have thrived and grown as big as they can get on quite moderate volumes, whereas you would obviously also have the guys that have grown on high volumes and the guys that have grown on even lower volumes. So at this point, I don't think we can say that, yes, you might get a slightly faster rate of growth by adding volume and using that as a primary driver within perhaps 60%. I would probably take that up to 70 or 75%, to be honest, for muscle growth. But I don't think that just adding volume will necessarily make you bigger in the end.
Mike, how do you feel about that? Do you agree, disagree? Anything you want to add?
I think the reason that adding volume won't necessarily make you bigger in the end is because you could exceed your maximum recoverable volume that you have as an individual. So long as you don't exceed that and you supply the adequate food and recovery modalities, I think you will continue to grow as long as you add volume. And I think that adding volume is a more dependable way of enhancing hypertrophy, at least in the medium term, than altering your program to be one of higher intensity. Or in other words, shooting to become as strong as you can for, let's say, sets of 2 to 3 reps can and will result in a certain degree of hypertrophy. On the other hand, shooting to be able to do as many or more and more sets, so long as you can recover, of 10 to 15 reps, and slowly increasing how many sets you're able to do while not decreasing the intensity, is probably going to result in more volume. In other words, if someone comes to me and they're after a large measure of hypertrophy and not particularly interested in strength, and they're going to say, you know, I've been doing a lot of doubles and triples and I'm getting strong, but I think my growth is like, I want to do more. I want to be able to grow more. What should I do? My advice to them would almost always be, you know, it's good that you're progressing in intensity, but I would say that it might be a better idea to do some more reps, and you'll be able to do more sets. And I think that'll lead to less strength gains, which won't be as cool, but it'll probably lead to more ability to do. Did I disappear from the video screen or no?
No, you're good.
Okay, it'll probably lead to a higher rate of muscle growth and a higher total level of muscle. I can put it another way. If someone says, hey, listen, so I'm wondering, I know what my ability to minimum amount that I need to do is, I know what my maximum recoverability is, should I go from one of those points to the other before deloading and repeating in a mesocycle? Should I jump by 10 kilos at a time and thus not increase sets week to week? Or should I jump by 2.5 kilos at a time, or let's make this more extreme, 0 kilos at a time, but increase sets week to week? Which one would lead to more strength, the first, to more hypertrophy, the second? I would say almost unequivocally. Now, I think that does a bit of a disservice to this discussion, and here's how. I think that progression in intensity is absolutely a driver of hypertrophy, as is progression in volume. So I think that the best case is to progress both in intensity and in volume. If time is not a limit to you, if you can recover, I would say you should progress mostly in volume, but somewhat in intensity, which means most of your microcycle to microcycle increases should come from adding sets or maybe repetitions. That comes with its own complexity. So let's just keep it simple and say adding sets. But some of it should come from adding weight. So maybe instead of putting 5 kilos on the bar or 7.5 kilos on the bar microcycle to microcycle, if size is what you're truly after, put 2.5 kilos on the bar micro to micro, make room in your recovery ability to add more sets. I think that's pretty close to optimal based on literature and theory and so on and so forth. So I think that volume is the predominant way to generate hypertrophy, and moving through various volumes is, but I think that saying it's just volume don't add intensity, I think is really short-sighted. I will qualify that statement. I think that if you're an individual who has a preset amount of time dedicated to training and does not want to alter that time, I have 4 sessions a week, each one's an hour. I come home and my wife will fucking stab me if I'm home 5 minutes later. I can't do this to myself. And if I leave early from work, my CEO will stab me. So I'm just getting stabbed left and right. If you have 4 hours or 5 hours or 6 hours or any number of hours to commit to training, increasing volume is a very impossible thing to do at that point. It'll fuck up your life, because where the hell are you going to, your training sessions have to get longer. You have to add more training sessions. It's a bad deal. In that case, I would absolutely vie to add intensity and not volume. So what I would do is stick to something like Borge's 10 sets a week total, or 12 sets a week, maybe even 8 sets, depending on your abilities. And if you can grow from that, instead of adding volume every week, I would add intensity every week, goes through a certain range, and then deload and repeat to get stronger over time. I think that's a great way to grow. If you have a more expanded arsenal to be able to dedicate time to training, if you can do whatever it takes, I can't say that's the optimal way to grow, but it's a really, really great one. And I think that's where this discussion is really going to end up going is, a lot of folks, especially in your sustainable development group, man, sustainability and more so balance with other factors of life, man, it really kind of rules out that progressive model of volume to a large extent. And there's a real big difference between searching for optimality and searching for an effective way to balance a good amount of results with your lifestyle. Brad Schoenfeld and I, a lot of times, we run a quest for optimality, because once we find what's optimal, then we can regress back and tell people, maybe you can do this, maybe you can do that if you can't get to optimal. But the quest for optimal is not the same thing as the quest for recommendable. A lot of people say, well, you see that new study, apparently, your MRV can be 30 sets a week. Oh, it can be, but it might not be, and you might not be willing to train that much. There's all kinds of things in which the best and the most is just, there's a car that can go 300 kilometers an hour. That doesn't mean you buy it and crash the fucking thing. Maybe you're not able to drive that. Maybe you don't want to drive that sort of thing. Can you imagine showing up to the dealership and being like, okay, which one's the fastest car? And they're like, well, that one's a race car. Like, I'll take that one. They're like, do you want a fast car? You're like, no, but I read these magazines and they say fast cars are great. And they're like, have you ever driven a fast car? Like, I don't even know how to drive a stick shift. So maybe it's not for everyone, and knowing what you're buying is probably a good idea before dipping into all this stuff.
Fantastic. And that's exactly what I wanted to, get out of this conversation, was to apply some context to this discussion. And something I always explain to my clients is that, we have optimal, and, in the most case, that's what we should be striving for over time. But, like Borge said, we have the real world, which gets in the way, and we need to adjust our expectations along the way and do what's best for the individuals. So moving forward, from this volume discussion, I want to talk about, how we're measuring volume now. And whilst this discussion primarily so far has been speaking of volume as number of hard sets per week per muscle group, we've had the introduction of effective reps or stimulating reps, or at least the rise in its popularity by Chris Beardsley, James Krieger, and so on and so forth. So I guess, Mike, I wanted to first ask you whether or not this is going to change the way that you monitor volume and how you're looking at volume as a whole.
It actually changes almost nothing about the way I monitor volume or treat volume as a whole, because at RP we don't really, unless you're a strength power athlete and weightlifter, and then things get a little bit different, and then volume's not that important anyway. It's a background variable, and then hypertrophy is not exactly what we're after in any case. But when we design hypertrophy programs at RP, our bottom end intensity, relative intensity, is around 4 repetitions from failure. Because the effective reps calculation, which makes perfect sense, is really pretty equivocal as to its fatigue to fitness trade-offs between 4 reps in reserve and 1 rep in reserve, or 0 reps in reserve. It doesn't really, the effective reps calculation isn't going to be really different between various programs and so on and so forth, because they all kind of get to the same reps in reserve. A real great place to do effective reps is to say, okay, if I'm doing a bunch of sets of 5s, but they're all 5 reps in reserve, Is that a good idea, or can I get in there and do some, Jesus Christ, myo reps, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's the perfect illustration of that. Myo reps is probably the way to, almost the best way and probably the most practical way to maximize the amount of effective volume you're doing, because you're always close to failure, and you always, the calculations weigh out in your favor.
Mm-hmm.
That being said, your training's got to be fucking kind of weird for the effective reps to get real funky on you. That's the first thing. The second thing is that it is, like, let's say you're doing straight sets of 10. There are probably other benefits of doing straight sets of 10 versus everything in myo reps all the time, for example, where your total volume isn't comparing as well to your effective volume, but it's probably more sustainable in the long term. I think that training with myo reps can be a great tool for when you're in a rush, for individuals that aren't super duper strong, individuals that aren't super very close to their recovery capabilities, etc., traveling, so on and so forth. But there is a psychological demand from things like myo reps that is pretty massive, and that being that close to failure every single set can really start to drain on you, and can lower your recovery demands quite a bit, or recovery abilities quite a bit. So I think that not myo reps per se, but I think if you take the effective reps concept a little too far, every set is going to be so crushing that you might not actually be on the most beneficial side of training anymore. So what I think, what I get the most out of the effective reps concept isn't a hard rule. Calculate your effective volume, and if it ever goes down or up, you're fucking ridiculous and you're training wrong. I think that if you've got a way to train in which the ratio of your total volume to your effective reps is way off, for example, if you're doing sets of 50 reps, and I mean each set is 50 reps, and you're only approaching failure in the last 5, fucking God. I mean, you're just pissing away time. But if you're doing sets of 10 or 12, relatively heavy, is it a good idea to switch instead to one set of 15 and then 5 sort of drop sets after that? In some situations, yes. Is that a sustainable way to train? It might not be the most sustainable way from a technique perspective, from involving the cardiovascular system perspective, so on and so forth. So that's my thoughts. A great guiding principle, but not to be religiously worshipped. Surprise, another thing, just like total volume, not to be religiously worshipped, but a good guiding principle.
Awesome.
Because I can already see, and Borge can probably speak to this, I can already see people fucking running, in your guys' group. You're going to put like, hey, here's a program you can try. And they're going to be like, I ran the effective reps calculation and it seems to be off. And you're like, oh my God, it's the only thing you do now is run effective reps calc.
Yeah, Borge, how are you using this concept now? Has it changed your approach at all? I know you've obviously been, discussing myo reps and things like that for quite some time, so it's not necessarily news to you, but your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think it's just like Mike says, it's a good kind of concept to view, or to have in the back of your mind when you start to discuss training volume, because I could easily support doing 20 to 30 sets if you were doing a lot of submaximal work. That's going to be just fine, and doing Mike's approach of just having 4 reps in reserve for every set. If you were to do the same amount of reps and the same amount of load, then for sure, as fatigue accumulates, you would be closer to fatigue or failure on the last few sets. And I mean, we have good studies, comparing like 3 sets to failure versus 5 sets of 5, and there are minor differences between those two, simply because they had the same amount of total reps and going closer to failure, which also induces more fatigue for sure, and a higher level of muscle recruitment, etc., etc. So I think that's another thing that needs to be contextualized when you start doing meta reviews on training volume. I also think it should be mentioned that the effective reps thing is not about going to failure at all. It's just a way to sort of calibrate the effect of certain volume. And myoreps is not either. The point of myoreps is not to go to failure. It's actually about managing fatigue, not chasing fatigue. So I think that's also very important to keep in mind. And since it's going to be a part of the program that we're going to present in only 3 weeks or so, it's going to be like half the training program, where the higher reps are going to use myoreps exactly to get a more effective volume faster, with shorter time spent in the gym. But it's going to be essential to cycle your intensity, meaning how close to failure or fatigue you are going. Because if you try to do that on every training, on every muscle group, every workout, then for sure you're most likely gonna end up having recovery issues.
Awesome.
Can I say
So
something about that real quick?
Yeah, so I think in general, I just completely agree with Mike. I think his perspective on it is great. I fully support that.
I think it, just to touch on something Borge just said, it's really, I don't want to say baffling or short-sighted. I was going to get a little bit insulting to the viewer, but I'm not going to do that. It's interesting, that's a term I'll use, when people come to the discussion of, what kind of, how close to failure should I be training? Or what's the difference between training to failure versus training, 4 reps away from failure, so on and so forth. Well, there are definitely exceptional situations, maybe aren't so exceptional, certain situations in which it's a really, really good question. For example, if your volume that you're able to do per week is artificially, even per workout, is artificially constrained to far below your maximum recoverable volume per week, then you're just not, just by scheduling, right? You just can't make it to the gym that much. You're not really going to be at higher risk of accumulating too much accumulated fatigue over the weeks because your volume is capped so artificially low. So you have to ask yourself, given that I'm only allowed a certain time in the gym, how hard should I be working? And the answer is fucking pretty close to failure. And in some cases, you should be going to failure for all. Like if someone says, okay, you got 2 sets to do here today, and then you can't train for another 5 days, you'd be like, fuck, failure on clean and jerks. Just kidding. Don't do that. No failure on clean and jerks. But, right. But yeah. Oh yeah. Failure. And maybe even beyond, right? If someone said you could only do 4 sets per muscle group per week, I would take all of them beyond failure. I'd get a spotter to fucking drag my ass out from under the bar, as long as it's safe. On the other hand, on the other end of the spectrum, when you're training, when you potentially can get close to your maximum recoverable volume, in other ways, when you can train plenty, the question of should I train to failure or stay away from it is a little short-sighted, because what is the purpose of training in the long term is to provide, as Borge said, progressive overload. How the fuck are you supposed, even if it's volume or intensity, doesn't matter, should be both. How are you going to provide progressive overload if you accumulate so much fatigue at the beginning of your training that you're not able to sustainably train for weeks and weeks and weeks before deloading, which is the real issue. So when someone says, how close to failure should I get? Those are, well, how long is your accumulation phase? And they'll say, well, it's usually like I go 4 weeks up and 1 week down. I say, well, 4 reps in reserve on the first week, 3 reps in reserve on the second, 2 in the third, and then 1 in the last one, or go to failure, deload, then repeat. And they say, well, and people will say, like, well, man, 4 reps in reserve on the first week sucks. Like, why can't I do 2 reps in reserve? Because what the fuck are you going to do with 3 weeks, man? You're going to go to failure because you're going to have to increase the volume and intensity. That means it's going to take you closer to failure. Your third week's going to be 1 rep from failure. Your second week, your third week's going to be failure. What the fuck is your fourth week going to be? You're going to die? You're going to take the day off, old age? Like, it's not a progressive model. You have to make room for progressions. So by that, you should really be asking 2 things about any workout you ever do. 1, is this workout going to be effective for what I want? 2, how does this workout fit in to the progressive long-term path of the rest of my workouts? If you can't answer that second point, then you have a real big problem. So for failure, look, if you're deloading next week or you're at such low volumes that fatigue doesn't accumulate, you should be going to damn near failure on every single set if you want. On the other hand, if you're a big volume commitment and you've got multiple weeks of increases ahead of you, you got to make sure to stay shy of failure to still get an effect, yes. So you don't want to be like 8 shy of failure. But you absolutely want to make sure that you're training not so hard that you're going to fatigue too fast and go nowhere shortly thereafter.
Awesome. And I guess just to summarize that, the range in which people want to stay in for the most part to get an effective rep would be, the 6 to 10 RPE. And, sliding up and down that scale is highly dependent on volume requirements within a program and time scale, before deloading or the duration of an accumulation phase. So some really good points there from both of you guys. I guess the final thing I wanted to discuss with you both is related to nutrition. And Borge, you've written extensively about dieting, and you talk about the circadian rhythms that dictate when and what we should eat during the day, but also seasonal circadian rhythms and how they dictate what we should eat throughout the year. Can you explain to listeners the rationale behind this eating strategy? And then, Mike, we can expand from there.
Yeah, I guess it's just from an evolutionary perspective where, we know that temperature and daylight and sunlight and all that tends to, excuse me, to govern your carb tolerance on an individual level. And then again, you also have a genetically determined carb tolerance, and also the level of inflammation and the training you're doing and the duration and intensity and all that stuff. But from my point of view, yes, you definitely see a variation in general carb tolerance in the general populations throughout the day, where insulin sensitivity tends to be higher systemically early in the day and then deteriorate closer to the evening and night, where at night carb tolerance and any given amount of carbs tend to induce a higher insulin release. That's what you see in the general population. Now, if you're young, healthy, lean, and all that, and you're doing daily workouts or whatever, just expending glycogen and creating a sink for incoming carbs, then for sure that should probably dictate when and where you place your carbs. So that's like the daily aspect of it, and then the seasonal aspect of it is simply eat locally sourced foods in season, because those will have the highest nutrient density. And as long as you have the food choices in place, I think macros and all that stuff should take like a secondary place. People tend to just start these insane discussions, micromanaging macros and calorie levels, and tend to ignore that there's definitely going to be a difference between having processed junk food and just having natural foods that you're making yourself at home. And yeah, from the seasonal aspect of things, there will definitely be, for a lot of the population on Earth, for many generations, be a scarcity of carb-rich foods during the winter time, simply because a major part of human evolution had an ice age, and so we would probably be evolutionarily adapted to subsist and sustain ourselves on mainly animal-based foods and fish, and less plant foods and carbs. And then as spring and summer arrived and we had access to these, we would probably gorge more on these. And so you also see some seasonal variations in general carb tolerance. And I think that's a good thing to just have in the back of your mind. Now, the last thing I want to add to this is that if you've sort of been eating carbs every day of your life since you were a child, then you might not be as metabolically flexible as would be of benefit to you. And by that meaning that you should be able to seamlessly switch between using fat and ketones for fuel and using carbs for fuel. Mike T. Nelson has been talking a lot about this, and I tend to agree with that general perspective that at least for certain periods of time during the year, you should perhaps try lower carb intakes, even going on keto diets and There's been a huge popularity around the carnivore approach and the zero carb approach, where people have reported some pretty amazing benefits from that. And I tend to think that for certain parts of the year, for certain people, there's definitely a benefit to having that, let's say, 4 to 6, maybe 8-week period of keto adaptation and lack of carbs and plant foods, simply to increase metabolic flexibility, so that when you reintroduce carbs and especially around your workouts, you will have a higher or better improved ability to switch from using fat as fuel when carbs are scarce, and then using carbs as fuel when you absolutely need them.
Cool. That's really, really interesting stuff. Mike, what are your thoughts on that, and anything that you would add?
So, a couple of questions about the evolutionary logic. The first question is, in a bimodal seasonal environment of winter and summer, or, fall and spring included, it could be hypothesized that during the summertime, when high carbohydrates from plant foods are available, the human physiology would favor an increased adiposity from consuming carbohydrates, so that an increased layer of fat could be created to take one through the winter when the total food volumes were not as high, and that carbohydrate consumption from accumulated stores or what have you during the winter would physiologically result in a lower propensity to create fat from carbs, because that would need way more calories than the winter could afford, and perhaps at that point carbs would be used more for energy at that very time and to fuel working muscles and so on and so forth. So to me, it's not entirely clear that during the summer humans are particularly predisposed to using carbohydrates for muscular shuttling via insulin or for energy. It might actually be the other way, or I could see how it could be the other way, where carbohydrate storage during hotter climates could be a huge benefit, because when they're around, there's lots of them, get as fat as possible from eating them, and then when you get to the winter, you're nice and fat, squirrel-like, so to speak. And then as the winter goes on, your body perhaps switches to more favorably using animals, proteins perhaps, but as well, it might burn carbohydrates more because there's just not enough of them to get fat off of anyway. So I think the evolutionary logic there could go both ways. First of all. Second of all, I think that the polarity of climates probably excludes a vast majority of humans. So if you're West or Central African genetics, you're 70,000 years outside of, actually never in that case, 70,000 years split from the other major races, and also have never really encountered a true seasonality in carbohydrate availability. There could be a rainy season and a dry season situation, but that's not really clear. It depends on the locale of when the rainy and dry season come. Sometimes it's during the summer, sometimes during winter, so on and so forth. I'm not entirely sure how that affects carbohydrates. So, for example, while in Northern Europe, carbohydrate availability naturally would be much higher during the summer and during the fall, in West and Central Africa, carbohydrate availability might be much higher during the winter because it would be the rainy season, whereas the summer would be the dry season. So I think that perhaps for European populations, perhaps for Asian populations, there is a considerable amount of veracity to this claim. I think that for South Asian populations, Southeast Asians, Aboriginals, and Pacific Islanders, and for Africans and much of Latin America, I think that dichotomy of winter and summer carbohydrate availability might at least not be as extreme, or possibly not be there at all, or be backwards. So curious as to your thoughts on that.
Borge?
Yeah, for sure. That's those are all good points. And hypothetically speaking, that could be a valid argument for sure, but I tend to think that systemic insulin resistance or carb tolerance is the major determinant of how well you handle those carbs. And even even several centuries back and several generations back, access to plant foods would be of the highly fibrous kind and low nutrient density or calorie density, to be more specific. And so just to compare it on a calorie cost versus calorie supply model, then gathering the foods required to fuel a human for a single day would require hours of work from plant foods and carb foods. And it will also require preparing and processing, to make that those carbs available for, through digestion. Whereas, getting a single animal, of course, that would also require probably a team effort and some high calorie expenditure. But, we evolved as subsistence hunters and also developed tools and weapons to be able to hunt and fish animals, and just getting like a single animal would often be enable us to feed a whole family for a week. So just like from an overall perspective, I definitely think that we would have. There's been a couple of recent papers digging into the anthropological evidence of this, and you probably, most of you have probably heard of Laurent Cordain and his papers on this, and I think we would be. We would probably have a high amount of animal-sourced foods in our diets, and then we would season carbs whenever available. But I do agree with the point that we would probably fatten up during summer to be able to tolerate the cold and hard winter with a lack of foods, for sure. But I'm not sure we can use that to support that we should have like a high intake of carbs during winter time, because I don't see there being any physiological protective effect against body fatness from ingesting carbs at that time. So in general, I think, carbs versus no carbs, I just think that it doesn't have to be coordinated with cold and winter, but we do see that the body tends to, through thermogenesis and shivering and all that cool stuff that people now tend to seek out, tend to increase fat oxidation, fat mobilization and oxidation. So it might be an advantage to take, to benefit from that during certain parts of the year. And then, of course, some recommend that you should never have carbs at all, but I just tend to think that, well, maybe there's a point in at least cycling carbs and having periods of low to no carbs to adapt the body physiologically to that, and then strategically add them over time. But yeah, there was also, you mentioned the Aboriginals, and I also remember there was a study where they actually reintroduced, or obviously they removed all the sugar and junk food that these Aboriginals had been eating for the last generation, and then reintroduced their traditional diet, which for Aboriginals tend to be a lot of meats and fish, and all of their metabolic health and obesity issues tended to resolve pretty quickly. So, of course, there's something to be said for the original diet, but with the modern food supply and the knowledge we have today, maybe just have a few things in mind with regards to the foods we evolved on. But again, a needs analysis is probably a good idea when we want to set up how to optimally eat.
Awesome. Mike, thoughts on having deliberate periods of very low carb to no carbs, and then transitioning back to higher carbohydrate intakes?
I think it's very dark in Norway,
yeah,
for sure.
Right.
You've nearly disappeared from the screen. Yeah, that's true.
Yeah. The sun is set now, so it's getting dark.
Awesome. What time is it, if you don't mind me asking?
It's 9:45 right now in the evening, so about 50 minutes, and it's going to be pitch dark.
Yeah. If you're after metabolic flexibility for some reason, I think that's very good to work for it. If you have a pretty consistent approach to your diet, it may not be worth the effort. I do think that really, really high carbohydrate consumption for a long time, especially during periods of mass gaining, can be taxing on your physiology and not the healthiest thing in the world. So periodic returns to lower carbohydrate intake might be a good thing. Folks that are training a lot, they're doing a lot of volume. I don't think they're ever going to drop their carbs very low. But I think that folks that lead a relatively normal lifestyle with fitness as a part of it can periodically drop carbohydrates relatively low and perhaps see some benefits there, especially if they have to drop their carbs low at some point. They're not going to get tons of headaches and stuff like that from the huge switch from eating 700 grams of carbs a day to 0. If you're used to cycling them a bit, then you'll probably be a bit used to that.
Cool. Well, yeah, really good to have both of your insight on that. A lot of people are discussing it on the forums, and I'm sure that will give them some better understanding as to your thoughts and opinions on that. So, Borge and Mike, thank you so much.
I would just like to add a small thing. Just as an interesting experiment that I learned from Rob Wolf in his 7-day carb tolerance test, where you just basically do like a simple blood glucose test 2 hours after eating and see whether you're below 115, which is the American standard. I can't remember I think it's milligrams per deciliter or something. Or 6.7 micromolars per liter. And this sort of tells you whether you're handling carbs well, whether you're releasing a sufficient amount of insulin for the carbs, and whether you're able to simply shuttle those carbs into glycogen stores. So I think we're probably going to get to a point where we're seeing the importance of insulin and glucose management, and not necessarily having them super high or super low all the time.
Mm-hmm.
So as far as individualizing your carb intake goes, maybe that could be a good place to start, and simply just be aware of how you feel after you've eaten. And I think most people should feel, energetic and warm when they've eaten, and especially if you're active and doing training. So that's my take on it.
Cool. Awesome. So guys, we'll wrap it up there. Thank you all for listening and tuning in. Mike and Borge, thank you for your time, and we'll speak to you all next time.
Thank you.